Dawn had not yet broken over the western frontier of the Soviet Union. Along the mist-covered rivers of Belarus, artillery crews yawned beside silent guns. Infantrymen smoked their last cigarettes before sleep. Pilots lay in their bunks, boots still on, because rumors had been swirling for weeks, rumors of German divisions massing just beyond the border. But Moscow had said there would be no war. Moscow had ordered restraint. Moscow had forbidden provocation. And in Moscow, inside the Kremlin's thick red walls, one man had already made decisions that would determine the fate of millions. When the first shells fell at 30:15 a.m. on June 26, 1941, it was not simply the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. It was the detonation of years of political paranoia, purges, miscalculations, and rigid orders that had quietly hollowed out the Red Army from within. The Wehrmacht did not just break through Soviet lines that morning. It shattered an army that had already been crippled by its own leader. This is the story of how Joseph Stalin's orders, issued long before the first German tank crossed the border, helped doom the Red Army before the invasion even began. In the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union possessed one of the largest armies in the world. It had embraced modern warfare theories, armored formations, and deep battle doctrine. Visionary commanders were experimenting with mechanized corps that could punch through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs with speed and coordination. Soviet military thinkers were, in many ways, ahead of their time, but none of that mattered once fear entered the Kremlin. In 1937, the Great Purge swept across the Soviet Union. What began as political repression soon turned its gaze toward the Red Army. Stalin, deeply suspicious of loyalty within his ranks, became convinced that conspiracy lurked everywhere, even among his most decorated commanders. The arrest of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the brightest military minds in the Soviet Union, sent shockwaves through the armed forces. He was accused of treason, of plotting with Nazi Germany, of undermining Soviet power. There was no real evidence. There did not need to be. Tukhachevsky and several other senior officers were executed. Thousands more were arrested, imprisoned, or shot. By 1938, the Red Army had lost the majority of its experienced high command. Roughly 3 out of 5 marshals were gone. 13 of 15 Army commanders were purged. Corps commanders, division leaders, staff officers vanished. Fear replaced strategy. Loyalty replaced competence. Young officers were rapidly promoted, not because they had battlefield experience, but because they were politically reliable. Many lacked training. Many feared taking initiative. After all, the wrong decision could mean a bullet in the back of the head. The Red Army did not collapse overnight, but it lost something invisible and irreplaceable: institutional confidence. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union marched into eastern Poland under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Red Army's performance was awkward, disorganized, clumsy. Communication failures were common. Coordination between units was weak. The Winter War against Finland later that year exposed even deeper weaknesses. Against a much smaller Finnish force, Soviet units suffered catastrophic losses in the forests and snow. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed because officers were too afraid to deviate from rigid orders. Stalin took note, but not in the way one might expect. Instead of acknowledging that the purges had gutted military leadership, he blamed incompetence, sabotage, and poor execution. The culture of fear deepened. Officers learned a simple lesson: follow orders exactly. Do not improvise. Do not retreat without authorization. Do not question Moscow. By 1940, Europe was burning. Germany had crushed Poland, overrun France, and humiliated the British Expeditionary Force. Blitzkrieg had stunned the world. Yet inside the Kremlin, Stalin believed time was still on his side. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he thought, had bought the Soviet Union precious years to rearm and modernize. But time is only useful if you use it wisely, and Stalin's next set of decisions would prove even more dangerous than the purges. Throughout 1940 and early 1941, Soviet intelligence delivered warning after warning: Germany was preparing to invade. Reports came from spies in Berlin, from military attachés, from reconnaissance units along the border. One of the most famous warnings came from Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, who transmitted detailed information about Hitler's plans. Yet Stalin dismissed many of these reports. He believed Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain still resisted in the West. He believed Germany needed Soviet oil, grain, and raw materials. He believed that any German buildup near the border was political pressure, perhaps even blackmail, but not an immediate prelude to invasion. More dangerously, Stalin believed that mobilizing the Red Army could provoke Germany into attacking. So he ordered caution. Soviet forces along the western frontier were told not to respond to German provocations. Aircraft were forbidden from flying too close to the border. Anti-aircraft units were often not placed on full alert. Defensive positions were incomplete. Ammunition stockpiles were stored dangerously close to the frontier, vulnerable to air strikes. Entire armies were stationed in exposed forward positions, crammed into newly annexed territories like eastern Poland and the Baltic states. The logic seemed aggressive: position forces near the border. But without full defensive preparation or readiness, those formations became targets. The Red Army in 1941 was massive on paper. It had thousands of tanks, including advanced models like the T-34 and KV-1. It had more aircraft than the Luftwaffe. It had manpower reserves that dwarfed Germany's. But numbers mean little without coordination. Many mechanized corps were under strength, poorly trained, and lacking spare parts. Radios were scarce. Command structures were confused by rapid expansion. Units were still reorganizing when the invasion began. Fuel depots were vulnerable. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip at airfields, easy prey for German bombers. And above all, initiative was paralyzed. Because Stalin's standing orders were clear: do not provoke Germany. Do not take independent action. On the night of June 21, 1941, multiple commanders reported unusual German activity. Reconnaissance confirmed troop movements. Intercepted communications hinted at imminent attack. Some local commanders requested permission to place troops on full combat readiness. The authorization came late. Too late. At 3:15 a.m., the sky exploded. German artillery pounded Soviet positions from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Luftwaffe struck airfields in massive coordinated waves. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Communications lines were severed. Command posts were obliterated. And in many sectors, Soviet troops had not even been fully alerted. Within days, entire Soviet armies were encircled in massive pockets: Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. Tanks ran out of fuel. Units waited for orders that never came. Some officers hesitated to retreat without direct authorization from Moscow, fearing punishment. The Red Army fought bravely in countless places. Individual acts of heroism were everywhere. But bravery cannot compensate for systemic paralysis. Stalin's earlier orders, his purges, his rigid command culture, his refusal to believe intelligence warnings, had created an army that was huge yet brittle. When struck with speed and coordination, it shattered. And as the Wehrmacht raced toward Moscow, Stalin retreated into stunned silence, reportedly withdrawing to his dacha for days, convinced that catastrophe had arrived. But the story of how those early decisions shaped the opening months of Barbarossa is only beginning. When historians speak of Operation Barbarossa, they often describe speed. But speed alone does not explain the scale of destruction that unfolded in the summer of 1941. What truly shattered the Red Army was not merely German momentum, it was encirclement. And encirclement on such a massive scale became possible because Stalin's pre-war orders had positioned entire Soviet armies in ways that made retreat almost impossible. The western frontier of the Soviet Union bulged outward in a giant salient around Bialystok. Soviet forces had advanced forward after annexing eastern Poland in 1939, stretching supply lines and compressing defensive depth. The logic was political and psychological: show strength near the border. But militarily, it created a trap. When the German Army Group Center struck with armored spearheads, they did not simply push back Soviet divisions, they sliced behind them. Within days, panzer columns met far behind the front lines, sealing enormous pockets. Entire Soviet armies found themselves surrounded, cut off from fuel, ammunition, and communication. Some units attempted breakout attacks, but coordination was chaotic. Radios failed. Orders were delayed or contradictory. Commanders waited for instructions from Moscow that could not reach them. The result was catastrophe. At Bialystok and Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were trapped. The Germans tightened the noose methodically, artillery pounding shrinking defensive perimeters. Soviet troops fought desperately, often with little food and dwindling ammunition. Some formations attempted organized resistance, others dissolved into confusion. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing columns trying to escape. But what made these disasters even more devastating was not simply the German maneuver. It was the Soviet command paralysis rooted in pre-war fear. Many officers had been trained in a culture where unauthorized retreat could be interpreted as cowardice or treason. Stalin had repeatedly emphasized that ground must not be surrendered without permission. The result was hesitation at critical moments. Retreats that might have saved manpower were delayed until encirclement was complete. The numbers defied comprehension. By early July, vast swaths of the Western Soviet Union had been overrun. Entire mechanized corps ceased to exist. Tank divisions, some equipped with modern machines like the T-34 and the heavy KV-1, were destroyed not always in tank duels, but because they lacked fuel, coordination, or operational command. Many of these advanced tanks had terrified German crews when encountered, but scattered, unsupported, and poorly directed. They could not alter the strategic picture. Smolensk became the next major flashpoint. Here, the Red Army attempted to stabilize the line. Reinforcements poured in from the interior. Fresh divisions, many poorly trained reservists, were thrown into battle in hurried counterattacks. Some Soviet formations achieved temporary local successes, even shocking German units with sudden armored thrusts. But these efforts were fragmented. German doctrine emphasized flexibility. Soviet doctrine in theory had once championed deep operations. But after the purges, the men who had developed and understood that doctrine were gone. Their replacements were cautious, often unimaginative, and deeply fearful of making independent decisions. Encirclements continued at Uman, at Smolensk, and most devastating of all at Kiev. The battle for Kiev in September 1941 became one of the largest encirclements in military history. Soviet commanders on the ground recognized the danger. German forces were advancing southward and northward in a vast pincer movement. The trap was visible. Withdrawal seemed the only rational option. Yet the decision did not rest with field commanders. It rested with Stalin. Stalin refused to authorize retreat from Kiev. The city held symbolic and strategic value. He believed abandoning it would signal weakness. He believed the Germans could be stopped. Orders were issued to hold positions. By the time permission to withdraw was finally granted, it was too late. German armored units had already linked up behind Soviet lines. The encirclement closed with brutal finality. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. The scale of loss was almost incomprehensible. Entire armies vanished from the order of battle. Equipment was abandoned in staggering quantities. Prisoner columns stretched for miles, guarded by small groups of German soldiers, because resistance had collapsed under exhaustion and hopelessness. The Red Army was not merely losing ground, it was bleeding out. And yet, paradoxically, something was changing. Because the deeper the Germans pushed, the more the Soviet Union's vast geography began to absorb the blow. Industry was dismantled and moved eastward beyond the Urals. Fresh divisions were raised. Siberian troops trained in harsh conditions, prepared quietly in reserve. But in the summer and early autumn of 1941, the Red Army stood on the edge of annihilation. And the roots of that near destruction traced back to decisions made years earlier inside the Kremlin, decisions that had silenced experienced generals, discouraged initiative, and locked armies into rigid postures. The Wehrmacht's brilliance mattered, but so did Stalin's earlier orders. And now, faced with disaster, Stalin would respond not with softness, but with even harsher commands. In the first days after the invasion, Stalin reportedly withdrew into stunned isolation. For a brief moment, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with iron certainty seemed overwhelmed by the scale of catastrophe. But that paralysis did not last. When he returned to the Kremlin, he did not return humbled. He returned hardened. If the Red Army had collapsed because of weakness, hesitation, or cowardice, then in Stalin's mind, the solution was not flexibility. It was discipline, brutal discipline. Orders began to flow from Moscow with increasing severity. Commanders who failed were dismissed, arrested, sometimes executed. Political commissars, previously reduced in authority, were reinstated to ensure ideological loyalty at the front. The message was unmistakable: the state would tolerate no weakness. Retreat without authorization became a crime. Panic became treason. Families of captured soldiers were stigmatized. Later, in 1942, Stalin would formalize this philosophy in Order No. 227, not one step back. But even in 1941, the spirit of that order was already present. Blocking detachments were positioned behind certain units to prevent unauthorized withdrawal. The NKVD enforced compliance ruthlessly. To outside observers, this appeared barbaric. To Stalin, it was survival. And yet, something more complex was unfolding beneath the terror. Even as Stalin tightened control, he began, gradually, to listen more to capable commanders who proved themselves in battle. Men like Georgy Zhukov rose through the chaos, not because they were politically pliable, but because they delivered results. Zhukov's defense of Leningrad and later role in organizing the defense of Moscow demonstrated a willingness to make hard operational decisions. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 became the first major strategic failure for Germany in the war. As winter descended and German supply lines stretched thin, Soviet reserves counterattacked. Fresh Siberian divisions struck exhausted Wehrmacht units. The myth of invincibility cracked, but the cost of reaching that moment had been catastrophic. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Vast territories were occupied. Cities lay in ruins. The Red Army that halted the Germans outside Moscow was not the same army that had stood on the frontier in June. It had been reshaped by fire, fear, and ruthless adaptation. Stalin's early orders had nearly doomed it. His later orders, harsh and unforgiving, helped stiffen resistance. But they did so on foundations built from unimaginable loss. The irony of history is sharp. The same leader whose paranoia had crippled the Red Army before Barbarossa would ultimately preside over its transformation into the force that marched into Berlin in 1945. But in the summer of 1941, that victory was unimaginable. All that existed was smoke, shattered divisions, endless columns of prisoners, and a realization echoing across the Soviet Unions. The disaster had not begun on June 22. It had begun years earlier, inside the Kremlin. From the frozen forests of Belarus to the gates of Moscow, the Red Army paid the ultimate price for paranoia, rigid orders, and fear. Stalin's decisions didn't just cost territories, they cost lives, hope, and momentum. But from these ashes, a new army would rise, one that would eventually crush the Wehrmacht and march into Berlin. History reminds us, the fate of millions can hinge on the choices of a single leader. If you were shocked by how decisions before the war shaped everything, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the story of World War II is far from over. More untold stories are coming your way,